I am Stephen Collins. I'm the CEO of Matter. Thank you for joining us for Tales from the Trenches, which is our first one of 2020, and is always one of my favorite programs because we really dig in and hear the stories from the trenches, the stories from the journey of the entrepreneurial journey from people who have built really interesting companies and who are building really interesting companies. Matter, for those of you who aren't here as frequently as I am, you can think we essentially do three things. We incubate startups. We have about 240 companies who are members of Matter. They are increasingly all over the world, and they are every stage from one person really trying to figure out a product market fit to companies that have 100 people and are scaling into the market, and we have a suite of services to help them. Second thing is we provide innovation services to big companies. We have about 65 partners. They include life sciences companies, health systems, payers, and a multitude of others. And we really get to understand what are their challenges and how can we help them with their innovation needs. And the third thing is we're a nexus for the healthcare community. And we do events like this that bring people together, to either be educated, to be inspired, to meet each other, to learn. So hopefully you have met some people so far this evening that you didn't know before or that you're reconnecting with. Hopefully you will be inspired by Shelly's story this evening and maybe learn something along the way. We take questions using an online platform. You go to matter.socialqa.com, whether you're watching the live stream or here in the room. You put in your question. You can upvote other people's questions, and the moderator will get to those in the course of the discussion. We have a peanut gallery in the crowd saying we should talk about expansion in New York. Thank you. Matter will be expanding to New York. We won an RFP from the city of New York to, in some ways, replicate what we're doing here in Chicago in New York. We are really excited about that. It will be a big project for us in 2020 to, we have a space identified, and so let me know if you want to learn more about that, but thanks for the question. So our moderator tonight is Ross Levine. He's the Chief Strategy Officer for VillageMD, and really glad, thank you for agreeing to do this. VillageMD, I think, is one of the most interesting companies in healthcare in Chicago and maybe around the country. They're innovating in value-based care in a way that is scalable and relatively unique, and there is an enormous amount of discussion and conversation in healthcare about value-based care, and they're actually doing it. They've raised, I don't know, a bunch of money. A lot of money. and are really doing some interesting work. Tim Berry, their CEO, was a guest at this in this forum, so you can find his program online if you're interested in learning more about the company and about Tim's story and the journey that they've experienced. Ross was there from the very beginning. Had gotten to know Tim at Accretive Health previously, where he'd helped build that business, has a long career working with early stage companies, helping raise money, helping companies grow, and I think he's going to add a really interesting perspective to the conversation. So with that, and you'll learn all about Shelly this evening, who has built a truly extraordinary company from scratch over the last 18, 19 years, something like that, in the senior care market. So with that, please welcome Shelly and Ross.
Thank you, everybody. Can you hear everybody here clearly? Great. So Shelly and I have gotten to know each other over the last hour or two here. So I very much enjoy getting to hear a bit about your story. And one of the first things I had said to you earlier today, being an entrepreneur is difficult. And it takes a lot of sacrifice. It takes a lot of dedication. Being an entrepreneur in healthcare, it's an entirely different level, just given how complex the industry is. And so everyone needs to have a story and a reason they get up and do this every day. So I thought it would just be really helpful for the group to learn more about kind of your story and why you ended up starting BrightStar, and go from there.
Happy to. Yeah, thank you so much. So I was going through a family experience looking for home care for my grandmother back in late 2001. And it was difficult. There wasn't one-stop shopping where I could hire one agency and have them provide non-medical and medical services that we were looking for. And so Grandma passed away about 4 months after we'd hired and gone through multiple different agencies, having to manage non-medical agencies and medical agencies for all the scope of services that she needed. And I was a CPA working in insurance at the time, CNA Insurance, overseeing their SEC reporting area. I was not an entrepreneur, never thought I'd be an entrepreneur. Accountant is probably as far from risk taker as you could possibly imagine. That's a role that I had. But having a passion for wanting to help families not go through what we had gone through, and kind of looking at the market and saying there are non-medical companies and there are medical Medicare companies. If you qualify and you wait, you can get those services. There wasn't someone who delivered what we were looking for. So I spent the next 6 months or so doing a lot of research, talking to a lot of people, seeing if I was the only or if there were others where this need resonated, and it did. And so started the company in late 2002. About a year after kind of starting a personal journey looking for care. And that's really been a lot of the driving force. And through those tough times, the great days are great, but the hard days is really what the entrepreneurial journey is paved by. But having that passion for doing it the right way, and even as we've expanded, kind of thinking about, is this the kind of care, and how are we going to ensure the kind of care 1,000 miles away for grandmas and grandpas, moms and dads, which is the reason why the business started in the first place.
No, that's great. And then as you think about, so one of the first things you had to do, right, was define the product. And so how did you go about that process? And then just, I think for all of us, it'd be really helpful to understand, I think most folks are going to understand what home health is, but clearly what you offer is pretty different than sort of traditional home health. So great to get some color there.
Yeah, of course. So we, first of all, kind of who we serve. So we're taking care of all age ranges, from pediatric through geriatric population. And we are doing it from a source of funding that's non-Medicare. So we don't take Medicare. In some states we take Medicaid. We didn't when we first started in Illinois. But the differentiation for us was nurse-led care. So my initial location and every single location thereafter has a director of nursing that's overseeing care. Very unusual in private pay, and non-medical, which is probably the preponderance of our business, is non-medical, certified nursing assistant type of care. That's one kind of point of differentiation. And then offering the full continuum of care, which was really our biggest struggle as a family, is, the mic just went on. I'll try to get my voice to carry. Look for those certified nursing assistant services like bathing, dressing, making sure grandma was taking medication, but also she was going through late stage cancer, and so what kind of injections did we need to do to manage her pain management? And that was going to be a private pay kind of scenario. So.
Thank you. So if I think about differentiation as well, I think it was differentiating to the consumer with the two things I just mentioned, nurse-led care and the full continuum of care, and we were not yet in franchising. But I think from the very beginning we knew really what our product were our caregivers. And so how were we going to be unique and different to attract them and retain them? And so from the very beginning, our model has been both home care, which is about 60 to 70% of our business mix today, but also staffing. So we will send in the same personnel to hospitals, nursing homes, assisted living. And I think that was really important and a big differentiation for us in terms of retaining personnel, because a caregiver is typically living paycheck to paycheck and they're doing the Lord's work every single day. And so thinking about, they don't know when a senior might need to go back into a hospital, and they don't know when a senior on a hospice is going to pass away. And so, but they still need to pay their bills and take care of their family. And so being able to take our best caregivers and plug them in on a staffing assignment until another home care case comes up has been a really important part, I think, of differentiation of attracting and retaining staff. And fast forward, almost 20 years now since I started the business. I was 20 then, 20 now. I always use the same joke. So we've already heard it, but is making sure that right now in this tight labor market, I think that's a big point of the differentiation of how we've been able to grow. Industry stats on turnover in the home care industry are over 100% typically. We run about 20%, still higher than I'd like, but a lot of great work that we're doing in retaining staff, and I think that's a lot of the way that we have nurses leading the care makes the caregivers feel confident that they have someone to go to if there's an issue, because they want to give great care. We pay a little bit above market, but I think the biggest differentiation is we can help them manage their life if their client is no longer their client. It might be a week or two for a home care case to be able to plug them into staffing.
That's great. And I know I mentioned this afternoon somewhat jokingly that. Oh, sure, yeah. Okay, is this clear? So I mentioned this afternoon, somewhat jokingly, we were talking that as I was thinking about this discussion and things that folks might find interesting, technology was an area where I basically was thinking, I was like, okay, we're having a conversation about home health, probably not on the docket for today. And I was pleasantly surprised during our conversation. It sounds like you guys have actually developed a proprietary technology platform. It sounds like you also made that decision up front during the product design phase. And so it'd be great to get some more sort of color on that and how you thought about that.
Sure, because I think that points of differentiation as we were thinking about franchising, were how are we going to help franchisees develop more revenue, and so we have a national accounts program for that. And then how are we in a franchising model going to have consistency of care? And if the business proposition from a heart perspective was taking care of grandmas and grandpas and moms and dads, then we needed to make sure that we could have that consistent service delivery, whether we were a company-owned model or a franchise expanded model. And so the investment in technology to ensure consistency we thought was really important. So I started in 2002 doing everything relatively manually and on QuickBooks. I think this is not scalable, and there wasn't a market solution then that did both home care, medical, and non-medical, and did staffing. So I was the inventor of doing the 53-page design document and hiring programmers to make sure I owned the IP rights. But from a very beginning, before we ever had a franchisee, we were on the same version, same database of technology, which in healthcare, that access to data and looking at trends and looking at diseases and what are the highest value clients and how are we making a difference, that access to data has been invaluable to our growth story.
How do you think about sort of data availability for other providers in the system? So one of the interesting things, it sounds like some of your professionals basically spend time doing care coordination and spend time basically bringing in other resources that are out in the healthcare ecosystem. And so it'd be helpful to just get some more color and some more thoughts on how you share that data with others and help coordinate for your patients.
Yeah, we're working on that very extensively right now. We're doing some pilots with some of the large health plans across the country. We kind of keep that a little bit on the down low, but we're working on a few of those things. And then with other large payers in terms of both taking their orders via connectivity, but also doing the data reporting as well. So making sure that we are assessing for each of our large national accounts and the payers that are paying for the services, what data do they need and how do we calibrate, because we're not Medicare, so we don't fall under the STARS program, but what are the commonalities that are important to them in terms of quality determinants and bending the cost curve. And so we're making sure, because we have access to the data, that we can share that information to and from.
That's great. It's really great. Closer. There we go. Gotcha. That's what my kids look like when they use a microphone at home. So basically, you had the vision, you had a problem you wanted to solve, you had a product from a care delivery perspective, and also this technology platform you started designing. Second issue when you're an entrepreneur, you need capital. And so how did you approach solving that problem? Did you bootstrap the company? Did you go out and you raise private capital? It'd be great to hear that part of the story.
Not always the fun part of the journey,
Sure,
but I am bootstrapped, and I still own 100% of my company today, even as we've grown and scaled and $500 million in system-wide sales. So that has been some of the scariest times, given the fact that I'm a CPA and not entrepreneurial or risk-taking generally by pedigree. But in the early stages, I had a $100,000 dollar amount kind of saved up. That was kind of my nest egg that helped grow the initial business. And then before we started franchising, our company-owned locations, we'd grown from 1 to 2 to 3. We were plowing that profit back in, but we were talking about this, back in the green room, there were several times when I had to put payroll on a credit card. And just had to pray that the business came in and bills got paid by our customers, because we're in a float business. We're paying our caregivers every week, but it might be 2 to 6 weeks before we're paid by our customer. So the faster we grew, the more scary it got from a cash flow perspective, but we bootstrapped. And then Chicago has some really great financing program for women. And so we accessed $250,000 through that program, through the Economic Commerce Development Department, and they were great. Gave me really great terms. Didn't have payments for a period of time, and then accelerated those once the business was doing well. But that gave me the next amount of funding that I needed to go from company-owned to franchise, which took a pretty sizable investment to do. And then as we've grown and scaled, we've accessed financing for acquisitions or expansion capital. And then as I wanted to diversify some risk, I did a debt recap a few years ago without a personal guarantee and took chips off the table, so to speak, but still have retained 100% of our business thus far.
That's amazing. And I would say at this stage, you pretty rarely hear of a company that's grown to where you are today, and we're still the founder, owns the whole company. So it's amazing.
It still has fun.
It still has fun. No, it's absolutely right. So basically you bootstrapped it, you got things going as far as product and operations, and then frankly you had a team to build. And and from a governance perspective, you need a board, and most folks basically will have strategic advisors or others. It'd be great to hear that part of the story and understand better about how you kind of surrounded yourself with the talent that you needed to help scale and build the business.
Yeah, sure. And so I'll start maybe with the board first, because the first, your cash is strained, so you don't make the hires that you make in the later stage, in the early stage. And so those 90 to 120 hour weeks were real for several years. But again, I hate to exclude the guys, but there is another program that's great for women across the country called Athena PowerLink, and it you apply to be awarded the opportunity to form a board. I didn't have experience, again, as an entrepreneur, and so forming my first board was all new to me, and finding really helpful advisors in marketing and finance and all those areas and not having to pay them for the first year was the benefit of Athena PowerLink. So I got a board for a year, tapped me into some great folks. Some of them are still dear friends. Gloria Jean Kvetko, who founded Gloria Jean's Coffee, was one of my original board members who taught me expansion through franchising and a good soul and how to grow the right way with taking care of your people. And she and I are having lunch in a couple of weeks, so we, this many years later, are still keeping in touch. I think those first few hires were what I needed and all I could afford. I think maybe 5 years into the journey, started being able to afford talent for the long haul. And what I mean by that is one of the things I think helped the journey along as I started thinking about where would the company be 2 years into the future, and hiring talent that had that size company experience. I didn't have the luxury or the cash to do that before 5 years into the journey, but as soon as I started hiring at 5 years, those that had, and let's say at 5 years I was a $25 million company, if I was going to be 50 in 2 more years, who were the people who had the experience for a $50 million company, not a $25 million company? And that was a really pivotal point, expensive, but a pivotal point that we weren't outpacing our talent nearly as fast. So I've been through probably 4 or 5 years ago, starting to really build out an executive team. It's changed, obviously, as the needs of the business have changed. 5 years ago, I was a $100 million company, and now I'm a $500 million company. So some people can make that trek, and some people can't. But my C-suite now, I have a head of franchise development, which is common in franchising, but I have chief technology officer, chief operating officer, chief marketing officer, chief finance officer, and then just have promoted someone to a chief strategy strategy officer, because healthcare, as many of you know, is changing pretty rapidly, and having someone who's really dedicated to those external partnerships and what are we doing with our data, how can we bend that cost curve and be a value part of the business equation. I need someone who's out there having those conversations and developing those strategies on a daily basis. So the C-suite has evolved, as has the board. I've reconstituted my board 5 times. I find about every 2 to 3 years in my first board, and my second board and third board, about every 2 years I would learn enough, because I'm a sponge and I work all the time and love it. I would get to where my mentors and my board members were peers. That is not true with my current board, because I have an amazing board now that includes a Harvard Business School professor, Boris Groysberg, who's absolutely amazing and did a case on our business at HBS, Harvard Business School. And then the just recently retired Chief Technology Officer from all of AT&T is on my board. So as we've grown and scaled and made better networking connections, we've built a better and bigger board that I still can't keep up with.
No, it's great, and we've honestly we've had we've had the luxury on our end of having some more continuity with our board. I think our board's beginning to expand. We're seeing that we're basically weaving some different folks in. I would also say I can appreciate personally your perspective on hitting different phases and then hiring talent that's kind of far afield, because otherwise you see teams that sort of change over every 24 months, and that's pretty disruptive, and it's also pretty limiting as far as kind of where you're going to even get in that next 24 months. So you refer to the first 5 years being kind of a pivotal point where you can start thinking about hiring and thinking about things a bit differently. So, if you think about the life cycle of a business, so that first 5 years obviously pretty critical. Most startups don't make it basically through that period, so big achievement to make it through that. What were the major lessons that you learned during those 5 years, and then how has that kind of influenced the company and the culture and sort of how you do business today, 20 years out, basically based upon what you learned in that initial period?
Yeah, I think the hiring for the talent 2 years out was a big one, but that was from lessons learned and mistakes made, not from genius ahead of time. So that's been helpful now. I think in the early stage too, I think I had a desire to hire people to do the things I didn't enjoy versus what I could do. So not my best use of capital to have hired a controller as early as I did, given the fact that though I hated it, I could do all of the books and bank reporting and all of that. So I should have made investments in the talent for the skill sets I didn't have, like marketing, sooner. And it's not where I deployed capital. So if I could go back and do it again, I'd keep sucking it up and doing the stuff I didn't like for longer, and deploy capital for the skill sets that I didn't have if I could go back and do it. And then I think the role of marketing, again, has been really critical to our growth story. We were willing to kind of reinvest back in as we started franchising and then trying to get the word out to the end consumer, to reinvest back into TV marketing and things like that are really expensive, and we're fighting above our weight class. But if we were going to be what we wanted to be when we grew up, we were going to have to do that. So.
Great. No, it's very helpful. And then you've talked a lot about franchising, which I mentioned this to you earlier this afternoon. Not a word you hear in healthcare very frequently. So I think it's something clearly very unique about your business. As you thought about scaling the business, kind of what was that thought process of let's try franchising? And then as you've gone through this journey, obviously, of becoming a company with a significant number of franchisees, how do you toe that line basically between consistency of product and consistency of the brand, the experience, but also giving people sort of the room to be entrepreneurial themselves and innovate and help you continue to basically improve the business?
Yeah, big topic. So, I founded the business in 2002, had grown it through 2004, and then maybe a little divine intervention, had an opportunity to invest in a couple of hotels, parlay some capital into an investment with real estate. And I went to new manager and new owner training at Choice Hotels, and I saw franchising. So I can't say that it was originally in the predefined destiny of BrightStar, but I saw franchising, and I was sitting there at training, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I think if done the right way, we could franchise our business. And how many more grandmas and grandpas and moms and dads could we help by looking at franchising as a method of expansion? And so fast forward, 24 months after seeing it firsthand, we had opened our first franchise location. But I think to your point, I think the reason why you don't see it in healthcare is you have to be willing to grow slower to enforce the right standards. And so my first franchise agreement, I took time to really get right, but we have the right to take away a franchise through a notification process, et cetera, if quality standards are not met and licensure isn't maintained. And that has evolved to giving us the right in the first franchise agreement to require accreditation. So private duty doesn't require joint commission accreditation, but we've invested in it and required it across our entire system. So, out of 25,000 agencies that do what BrightStar does across the country, we are the only one to be recognized by Joint Commission as Enterprise Champion for Quality, and that means more than 95% of my locations have to be accredited. So we require franchisees after 1 year in business to become accredited. So we're really focused on that quality. I think technology allows us to monitor that, and we have one full-time person for about every 3 franchisees. So we're very heavy support, quality control. And that's about 4 times the level of infrastructure as a typical franchise, but the numbers still work out for our franchisees and for us.
It's great. It's very helpful. And then, markets are not static. Businesses are not static. And so, you've been doing this for 20 years. The reality is a lot of what's around you has...
20, yeah.
Exactly right. So a lot's changed during that period. And so, what are the big things that you've seen, basically at a macro level with the industry change, and how have you and the team adapted those to basically maintain a competitive platform and continue growing at this pace?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has moved to, long-term care. When I first started, it was about 2% of the funding model, and now it's probably 15 to 18%. And so that's been a big evolution, bless you, both positively in terms of helping our seniors pay for the ability to remain at home, which is great, but compliance issues, and every single one of the long-term care insurance companies want a different method or format of their nursing notes and things like that to be sent. And so I think the investment in technology, while being a technology provider to our franchisees, is a thankless position on a daily basis typically, because there's always more that they think we should do, even though we're investing in the strategic areas we believe are important. It has been a large part of why our franchisees have grown to be about 3 times the average volume of businesses for the same longevity in the industry, is having that technology so we can sell the value proposition to commercial insurance companies around how can we bend the cost curve, how can we build protocols for our caregivers around things that need to be done on each shift. As of 12/31, all of our franchisees were required, or we will default and take back franchises, to have all of their caregivers, above 70% of caregivers, on a mobile platform that all of our caregivers are using. So it's GPS enabled. We know that they're really at the client's home. We know within 8 minutes that if they didn't show up, that they're not there, and that's a safety issue for our patient. And they're doing all kinds of data gathering based upon a care plan that's also automated as to what are the tasks that need to be administered, and has there been a change in condition, so that our nurse can intervene on a more smart basis without reviewing real time all of the notes from all of the caregivers. It's queuing up what's a critical protocol. And so I think the technology ability to evolve, react, and share data has been really critical. Our national account programs, about $100 million of our $500 million of system-wide sales. If we hadn't invested in technology and we didn't have the differentiation on quality, that would be revenue that our franchisees wouldn't have, and it's typically 5 to 10 points higher margin than the rest of the business.
That's great. And one of the things I was thinking about actually walking in today too, what does a healthcare franchisee look like? So is there an archetype that you look for, or is it an archetype typically finds you? Is it a pretty diverse group of people? Be helpful to get some more detail there.
Yeah, and it's evolved. So in the first 7 years, it was probably more sales-focused franchisees, bless you, because we needed those that were going to go out and really hard hit the pavement in the marketplace, because our brand wasn't known. As 2011 happened and we were on Undercover Boss, we got much more visibility and awareness of our brand, and so that's allowed us to make, I think, a critical pivot to supporting our franchisees hiring salespeople, and really looking for those as franchisees that have an operations focus. So there's more moving parts in the business on the inside than there are the sales processes outside. So we've evolved to more of an operations-oriented franchisee, typically a C-suite executive that went through a family experience with home care. 85% of our franchisees have been through a family experience with home care, either good or bad, in the 24 months becoming a franchisee. And so that makes them think about, like I did, wow, this is not being done that well, and how could I make a difference and do this? And then they start searching for the brands, and we're one of the only ones where you can do medical and non-medical. And I think people, if they understand healthcare at all, or they understand the journey from their own consumer perspective, home is going to be the setting of the least costly care with the better outcomes, with the best outcomes. And so the consumer that's a C-level executive used to making $100,000, $250,000 per year. They're smart, they're educated. I think 80% of our franchisees have a college degree or higher. So it's an educated, higher income individual who gets that they want to align with those that can help that nurse coordination of care, where more things are going to evolve and more payers are going to want that type of clinical expertise to intervene before a bad outcome occurs.
God, so it sounds like what you've done is you've basically built a sort of a decentralized or differentiated culture of entrepreneurs that look a lot like you. To be honest, sounds like they have personal passion behind what they're doing, and it's somewhat similar backgrounds. That's great. That's a great way to do it. You mentioned Undercover Boss. On the list of things I never thought I'd be doing in my career, one of which would be sitting with somebody who actually has been a participant in Undercover Boss. So, I'd be remiss not to ask. There's a story there. There has to be one. So how did that happen? How did it come about? And then, lessons learned. So, I haven't seen that show in quite some time, but every single one, people have epiphanies.
Yes.
And so, kind of, what were the epiphanies, and how has it changed how you run the business?
Yeah, sure. So how I got privileged enough to be on the show is I won, or was awarded, the Entrepreneur of the Year by the International Franchise Association in February, I think, of 2009 or 10. And the show was doing well at the time. They had just passed season 1. And they went to the International Franchise Association because they had several franchisors in season 1, and went to the IFA and asked for the top 25 franchises that should be considered for the show. And so I was one of those, since I had just won Entrepreneur of the Year. But this will say a little bit about my personality, which is persistent, not quite crazy, but persistent. The producers came out. They were feeding live feed to CBS, and they liked my energy and liked the story and liked the diversity of the model. But they kind of had an internal code of only businesses of $100 million or higher. And I was about 50 million at that point in time. So they said, thanks. We really like the category. We thought it was going to be depressing, and it's not. You've opened our eyes. So we're going to go talk to all of your competitors and pick one of the larger brands and put them on instead of you. And I went, oh, well, I'm glad you're interested in our segment. And I thought about that overnight. I went, that's BS. And so I went and I stalked maybe and found all the executives that had been on the show at CBS, and I put together a 4-page document of why BrightStar, why a bootstrapped founder, because they hadn't had one. It was all hired guns in the first season. So how about a little bit of America in there with the self-made success story, bootstrapped. And here's all the different kind of scenarios of settings that I could go, because we do childcare and most of our competitors don't. We could do seniors, but we could also do staffing and be in a community or a facility. And I sent it overnight mail to about 20 executives at CBS while they were out, as I came to find out, interviewing many of my competitors. They might not have found what they wanted, but by the time that they all were like, well, maybe this is somebody we should kind of come back to and from the show, and I kept stalking. My run rate's 67 million. My run rate's 75 million. My run rate's 88 million. They're like, okay, well, at this pace, by the time we do the show and it airs, we'll meet our $100 million. So they came back, and that's how I got on the show, but through a very persistent process. So when turned down, you got to keep doing it as an entrepreneur. Path's not always easy up front. And then lessons learned. I did go out and I kind of impersonated a caregiver. And a couple things came out of that. I realized from our caregivers that were in a staffing scenario, because they're paid more than the staff that are in the facility, they're kind of the black sheep, and that was actually one of the quotes on the episode that aired, is our caregiver referring to herself being treated like the black sheep. And so we looked for proactive ways we could go into the community or facility and get our caregiver to be more treated as part of the team that's there to help, and helping them know what they were gonna, how they might be treated before they actually went in and were treated that way, was one. The second was a sweet gentleman who actually proposed to me on the show. He's like 80, 82, 85 years old. He was so sweet. It was very adorable. In an hour, I'm like, I don't think you know me well enough to propose in an hour, but very sweet. I kissed him on the cheek, and he's like, you made my year. But I was there to see a caregiver come and a caregiver go, and seeing that the client had to train the caregiver at every single shift instead of having better coordination from one shift to the next, particularly for 24-hour cases, of having the caregivers communicate with each other so the client didn't have to be the one telling the next caregiver what happened on the prior shift. And that really led to a lot of our technology developments of care in the home. It took us 5 years and $10 million to get the care in the home mobile technology to where we wanted it, but it was some of the ideas coming out of Undercover Boss and seeing it firsthand.
So let's talk about how that plays out. So I'm a caregiver. I'm coming in for the second shift. Do I have a mobile app or something where I can basically pull up all the notes and see what's gone on basically beforehand? Is there actually a sit down between the two caregivers? Is it a direct handoff? How does that work? Yeah,
well, it won't be a sit down between the two caregivers in front of the client, but their mobile app will say, what got done, what tasks got done or potentially didn't get done on the last shift. And because of the mobile app, if there was a problem on the last shift, the client refused to take medication, they weren't eating well, they didn't sleep well, there was a unusual incontinence issue, then we are able to have that be able to flag through the technology to the nurse, and then the nurse is interceding with phone call to the next caregiver to alert them to the situation that might be different than what they would expect.
Okay, great. My last question, then we can start going to the Twitter feed here. My last question is one of the things I was thinking about is you've done this, you've been successful. For folks listening today, if you could do it all over again, are there one or two things you'd look at and say, knowing what I know now, this is what I would do differently?
Yeah, I think the two areas where I would do things differently, we've talked about talent and hiring sooner and not replicating one's own talent. So I think that's one. The second, I think, is on the franchisee selection. And so that may or may not be applicable. I think a lot of businesses can be franchised, but they have to be thought through well. I did write a book on this, Grow Smart, Risk Less. So that's on Amazon on whether your business should be franchised or not, because I was concerned about people looking at it as a way to grow fast, but their business might not be franchisable. But in selecting franchisees, I think we have really learned going slower and building more homework into the franchise sales process gives us a way to see whether they're going to be a good compliant franchisee. If they won't follow the homework or the assignments in between sales calls, they're likely not going to follow my model. And following my model and having consistency across the country is critical to a franchise brand.
Okay, great. No, it's very helpful. So leading question from the audience here that has been kind of blowing up since about minute 2. So you mentioned about basically low turnover and high retention rates. And so I think folks want to understand a little bit better about how you're doing that and sort of what culture you put in place, are there structural or compensation mechanisms that you put in place basically to keep that turnover so low?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's evolved over time. I mean, we certainly were, 5 years ago might have had a 60% brand turnover rate, and now, being much lower than that. We built a talent management team at the franchisor level. So we're building recruiting and retention programs, best practices, metrics for all of our franchisees' offices to follow. We require at certain revenue sizes a dedicated recruiter at the franchisee level, and that's the one that my talent management team is working with to focus as much on recruiting as retention. And then I think something that we do, which maybe more applicable to franchising, but is unusual in the investment that we make. Franchisors, it's very common to hold a franchisee convention every single year to share what's changed and best practices and what are the strategies and what to get prepared for. And so that's common. We do that in the fall. But every spring we also do a branch leadership conference, and that's to bring in my franchisees' frontline managers, their directors of nursing, their salespeople, the recruiters, to give them firsthand information about how do you hire well, how do you retain well, and then always rolling out that new protocols and best practices in terms of recruiting and retention. Our franchisees do tend to pay a little bit more in the marketplace. That's strongly encouraged. But I think a lot of the reason why we retain our caregivers in our model is it's pretty scary to be out there and be a caregiver and have a change in condition for a client. And they're there to, really take care of people. I mean, what they do every single day. I mean, we're so grateful to all the caregivers that we have. Being able to know that they have a nurse that they can call at any point in time, 24 hours a day, if something changes in the condition of their client and they don't know what to do about it, gives a lot of security that they're not used to having to any other brand. And so when we or our franchisees are debriefing, why did you come to BrightStar and why do you stay? And we do stay interviews. Very common to do exit interviews. We do stay interviews to understand why they came and why they stay. And having access to that mentor, that advisor, and that director of nursing is critical to the strategies that we deploy. So apply that to any model. I think it's about educating the employees, continuing to develop up their skill set, which we do with a lot of free continual education for them every single year. But I think it's also making sure they have a mentor that's helping them on either the anxiety of not doing a good job on a daily basis or helping them with career development.
Great. No, and I love that idea of a stay interview. I've never heard of a company doing that, so that's really cool. Medicare Advantage is basically in every healthcare growth platform today, coming up in some form or another. I think folks want to get a better understanding about how does Medicare Advantage play in for you today, and how are you thinking about it over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, so Medicare Advantage has just recently started paying for non-medical supplemental benefits, because we don't participate in Medicare programs, but or bill Medicare directly. But now some of the health plans, because of the changes in Medicare Advantage, are starting to do that. I don't think they've figured that out actuarially. So I used to work with my actuaries in the health insurance plans quite a bit. I was with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Colorado before coming to CNA Insurance, and so the only group maybe a little nerdier than the accounting group were the actuaries. God love them, but I don't think they've yet figured out the cost curves, right? So what we've at least seen thus far is the number of hours that they're willing to pay for, because it's very costly. They don't yet have a handle on doing enough to probably make a difference. So a lot of pilots, a lot of people are really wanting to test, learn, and iterate. And because of our data set, we're participating in a lot of those conversations and a lot of those trial conversations in terms of what's your segmented population. You can't do it for everybody, but what's your segmented population of your frequent flyers to the hospital, and is there a certain diagnosis? And we have a top 5 where they're more likely for an admission or a readmission, and those are the ones that we're looking at some pilots where it might be expensive, but if they can keep them out of the hospital far less expensive to do that. But everything right now is in piloting stage. I think over the next 3 to 4 years, 3 to 5 years, more data will be shared as to what are those interventions. And even though it looks like a loss leader in terms of cost without an increasing revenue on the Medicare Advantage side, if they can tip down the scale of claims on the hospital side by having some proactive intervention, I think that's where we will evolve to, and that's where we're making our investments now with clinical pathways and evidence-based protocols and all the data gathering and data set sharing that we can do.
And are the plans sharing that data with you? So I mean, do you actually have cohorts and you're able to track and sort of see what the overall cost outcomes look like?
Yeah, that'll be part of the agreement of the ones that we are looking to provide some services is dual data share. Because I think a lot of companies, and we would be guilty of it as well, a lot of companies in our industry, private pay, home care, say that they reduce readmissions and bend the cost curve. Well, how do you know if you're not looking at claims data? So you have to have a two-way form of data sharing to know really for that population with that unique identifier for that insured, how has the cost curve changed basis that what their profile would be not in our program. And so bending that cost curve and having that data share is going to be critical for their knowledge and willingness to pay, and us getting better as to is it 2 hours of CNA time and 1 nursing call, or what are those interventions with telehealth combined with personal face-to-face? And those are the things we're all going to be learning together over the next few years.
So you just touched on a few interesting things. So the fun part is that we can touch on all the buzzwords hopefully before we get down here. So Medicare Advantage, big one. Basically, just in technology in general. So telemedicine and big data. The reality is you have a technology platform. It's gathering a significant amount of data on patients all over the country. And so, B, you have this opportunity where you effectively have a platform where you have people in homes and patients in homes every day where you can test out new technologies. And so how do you think about, basically for, peripherals and for basically remote monitoring technologies and, different capabilities? Are you guys starting to partner with other technology companies to round out the platform further?
We're absolutely looking at that. So those are things that we're looking at in agreement review, doing some pilots in different locations, because I don't know that there's a clear winner yet. I think what we've seen is most of our seniors are resistant to wearables. And so what's the monitoring going to be that's not wearable dependent? Sorry if there's some wearable businesses in the room. Thus far, we have seen a huge resistance to wearables. So we're looking at other things, but as things are evolving in terms of connectivity with Alexa and Echo and all of those kind of things, those are the kind of things that we're looking at. We believe, in the next 3 to 5 years, as we continue heading towards $15 minimum wage and beyond, there's going to have to be a package solution of what are the hours of care that's face-to-face for socialization, and most common hours of fall risk with the kind of traditional care that we provide today. But how do you make sure that a senior is safe the other hours of the day without having to have a caregiver there, because that's expensive to have a caregiver 24/7. So what's the combination of, and how do we package that up? So we're absolutely in the market looking at and piloting some of those technology solutions now, and who the winner is today might be different than who it is 2 to 3 years from now.
Great, that's helpful. And then as far as so right now, you have a lot of this data, from a metrics tracking perspective. So if you give a little more insight into what you're tracking for your own quality purposes, and basically your own sort of reporting, as well as what the plans are starting to ask you to track, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so all the kind of normal things in terms of net promoter score and quality factors and incidents and falls and hand washing techniques and all those kind of things that I think are just normally part of healthcare. I think what we're starting to see from our national account partners is utilization and fill rate. So when they call and make a request or submit a queue request for care, what's the time it takes for us to have a caregiver in the home? Because I think that's been a long time lag traditionally in healthcare, particularly in the Medicare home health side, from the desired start of care to when care might start, might be 3 days. I think that there is a lot of awareness and data to say that a lot of the rehospitalizations can happen in that first 7 days. And so how quickly we get there can really bend the cost curve proactively. And so a lot of the data that we're getting asked for is more around the time between the order request and when the caregiver can be there as anything else. And then the normal kind of readmissions, admissions, number of days of hospitalization, et cetera.
Okay. No, and that all makes sense. So you mentioned Net Promoter Score, and and I think if we think about typical home health agencies, especially some of the smaller ones, Net Promoter Score is probably not something that's necessarily talked about. Your organization has very high Net Promoter Scores, and so what are the big things you've realized from whether it's from a technology perspective, a clinical engagement perspective, those things that basically make this a sticky offering and basically make it one where your patients frankly like it so much?
Yeah, I think it's really important to go beyond the Net Promoter Score populated question of how likely are you to recommend BrightStar to friends and family, to sub-questions to look for the correlations in the data between what are the real drivers of a promoter versus a detractor, and how can you move a passive up. And so some of that has been has informed some of our communications with our families in terms of we're contacting our family because we saw this was a big driver of our Net Promoter Score. We're contacting our families 24 hours after the start of care, 7 days after the start of care, and every 30 days thereafter. And so that drives some of our operational cost, but the impact on Net Promoter Score is very high. We survey 10% of our families every month. And they will get queued back up usually every 6 to 8 months. So we're trending it, and we're looking at our customers in terms of their Net Promoter Score and what are the drivers of those scores and what can we do about it. We also are doing the same thing through a third party, both to the customers and to the caregivers. 10% of our caregiving staff gets a call to look for their Net Promoter Score or caregiver engagement score, and then sub-questions where we can look for those correlations in terms of education, mentoring. Why do we have such a high retention rate and low turnover? We're using the equivalent of Net Promoter Score for our caregivers, and then looking for the drivers of the high scores and the drivers of the low scores to do something proactive about it.
Okay, that makes sense. One of the other areas here. So if you think about basically how your business has grown, so a lot of we talked about today is care in the home. One of your newer business lines is BrightStar Senior Living. So you're actually having facilities basically where folks can move, communities. There we go. So basically where folks can move for assisted living and other services. How are you? What was sort of the impetus for that, and how do you think about your customer base kind of in between either the home environment or a BrightStar Senior Living environment? Kind of when does that change? When does that change get made? And what does that look like right now? You're in 2 or 3 states. Basically, what does that look like over the next 5 years as you think about the senior living channel?
Yeah, I think for us it was just, probably part of the same journey that got me to the industry in the first place, is trying to make a difference and really meet the customer where they need us to be. And so what we saw is that we would have families whose family member we were taking care of reaching a certain stage of high acuity or dementia, where the family determined it was holistically better to look at a community setting and would be looking to us to make a recommendation to communities in the area. And so, like, how can we be a part of this journey? We already know the family member. How can we help them make this transition into a senior living setting? We tend to be very high acuity on the assisted living side, and then half of the community is memory care. So we're about 40 to 44 rooms. Half of those are high acuity assisted living, half of those are memory care. And it was just really trying to meet our consumer where their journey might take them. AARP studies would say approximately 90% of all of their membership want to stay at home for forever. And so I think we still are, obviously that's where our core business is. It's where I'd want to be, and as long as family members can remain safely at home and they can afford to remain at home. Because once someone goes about more than 12 hours of care per day, an assisted living environment will be neutral on cost. So for every hour beyond 12 hours that they need hands-on care in the home, then it becomes sometimes a lifestyle or a affordability decision for the family, and we still wanted them to have the high touch and high clinical intervention in a supportive way in our vision of senior living. I looked at a lot of the senior livings, and many of them we staff, and we're grateful for that staffing business, but many of them are 200 to 300 rooms, and that isn't what some of our seniors were looking for. And so my original kind of prototype, I trademarked it back in 2009. I didn't roll out our first community until 2014, so it took a little bit of time. But when we envisioned that first community, is what I told the folks that we collaborated with to design the first prototype, is I want this to feel like moving from home to bed and breakfast, not from moving from home to institution, which is why we're so big on the word community versus facility. We wanted it to feel very much like their home and like a bed and breakfast kind of setting. Yeah, you're communal for meals, but the activities and the person-centered made them feel like it was their own home, not institutional or facility-based.
Got it. And then how did you choose the first market? So when you were going to do a pilot, did you find a partner? Did you guys look at where you had patient concentration? What was the approach you took?
We let our franchisees know that we were going to be looking at this model probably in 2010, 2011, and we built a competition for our franchisees to apply to be the first market that we were going to enter, because I won't do anything in franchising without taking the risk myself, bless you, and making sure that the model worked. That was true. I had 3 company-owned stores before I ever franchised. A lot of franchisors never have a company-owned unit, and they just look at the dollars and they franchise something they've never done. I can't imagine doing that in my franchisee's livelihood. Similarly, on the senior living side, I wanted to take 100% of the risk and figure it out, tweak the model while it was under my ownership, and then transfer it to a great franchisee. So we took applications. It is a big investment, so the investment range for my home care brand might be $100,000 to $200,000. Our senior living communities might be $6.5 to $8 million. So it's not for every franchisee, but we did have several apply, and Jeff Tews and Susan Rather in Madison are usually one of our top performing and best-hearted franchisees, and both Jeff and Susan have served on my franchise advisory council chairing it, so know them very well and are dear friends. And it takes a special personality as a franchisee to be a pilot of anything, because usually as a franchisee you expect things to be already thought through and kinks worked out and things like that. But to pilot, to truly partner, takes a more cooperative spirit and learning and rolling with the punches, and Jeff and Susan had that personality. So our agreement with them is that we would fund it, we'd get it to where it made money, and then we would put it to them for just our cost up until that point in time. And any embedded profit, which was over $1 million, the value of the property compared to what our costs were, they had kind of an embedded gain of $1 million. But for that, they really had to kind of continue working with us and evolving policies and procedures. So I think that's been a great way of finding the balance between partnering together and evolving the brand. One of the questions you asked me earlier, and I didn't answer it, how do you kind of balance that entrepreneurial spirit of the franchisees with wanting to iterate or tinker with the brand, with opportunities that they see in the marketplace? And we've evolved this, but we do a kind of a Fran Shark competition at our franchisee convention. So they have to submit proposals. We narrow it down to 3, and then they get up on stage and are judged by their peers. The one that is judged to be the highest potential for the brand is the one that we get behind with dollars and resources and support from the franchisor. But only one of the three big ideas are the ones that are going to be the ones to likely roll out to all franchisees in the next year or two.
Perfect. Well, we have about a minute left. I've never finished anything on time, and we're going to do it. So I think to close it out, new year, new decade, everybody's kind of going through that process of planning and what's going to be different. What's going to be different for you? How are you thinking about this next decade and kind of where you're going to be focusing your time and energies and what's going to change?
Yeah, we're in 39 states now, so we've got about 340 locations. I think to really be the brand that we want to be over the next 5 years, we're going to need to get to the parts of the country that we're not in now. So we can service within about a 30-minute drive time about 75% of the population of the United States. But there are markets where we can't cover. And as we're looking to do more integration and partnerships with the large payers, we're going to need to be in states that currently cows probably outnumber people, which is why we're not there yet, but we need to get there. And so we're looking at a lot of acquisition talent. I just was very fortunate to hire a new CFO that had a lot of M&A experience, a lot of multi-site location, non-franchising. So franchising will be new for David, but he is already bringing a discipline. He built huge protocols on FP&A, financial planning and analysis, and so it's really taking our metrics and our ability to coach to a whole nother level. And acquisitions will be a large part of the year ahead. 2 of them in the works right now.
Perfect. Well, congratulations again. It's a wonderful business. You should be very proud of yourself and your team, and thank you, everybody. Have a great night.